Jake Martinez had exactly 3 rules for living peacefully in the ass exurge of the galaxy. Rule 1, keep your head down. Rule 2, mind your own damn business. Rule 3, never, under any circumstances, get involved with anything that bleeds, breathes, or has more teeth than a decent human being should possess. So naturally, when a ship the size of a small moon crashed into the asteroid field outside his salvage station, Jake's first instinct was to pretend he hadn't seen it. He was getting really good at that. Just last week he'd successfully ignored a distress beacon, 2 territorial disputes between mining colonies, and what appeared to be either a very ugly diplomatic vessel or a very pretty garbage scow. But this ship was different. This ship was on fire, spinning like a drunken ballet dancer and heading straight for his coffee maker. Jake had priorities. "Oh, come on," he muttered, watching through his viewport as chunks of alien metal scattered across his perfectly organized junkyard. "I just got that section sorted by molecular density." The ship hit the surface of asteroid B-7749 with all the grace of a dropped piano. Jake waited exactly 37 seconds for the inevitable explosion. When it didn't come, he waited another 37 seconds, out of spite. Still nothing. "Fine," he told his coffee mug, which had somehow survived 3 years of asteroid impacts but couldn't survive one missed breakfast. "But I'm billing somebody for this." Jake suited up with the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own execution. Outside, the wreckage was impressive in that special way that said, someone's having a really bad day. The ship was definitely alien, all curved surfaces and what Jake liked to call aggressive architecture. It looked like someone had crossed a battleship with a very angry catfish. He found the survivor in what used to be the cockpit, 8 feet tall, covered in scales that shifted from deep purple to silver, with arms that could probably bench press a small planet. Classic apex predator design, the kind of alien that made humans look like particularly optimistic snack foods. The creature was dying. That much was obvious from the way it was leaking various colorful fluids across the deck. It saw Jake approaching, and did something that sounded like talking, if talking involved gargling gravel and threatening the laws of physics. "Sorry, buddy," Jake said, keeping his plasma torch ready. "I don't speak intimidating death rattle." The alien reached toward a sealed compartment with one massive claw. Jake followed its gaze, and immediately understood why his day was about to get infinitely worse. 2 tiny faces peered out from behind the transparent aluminum. Fuzzy faces, with big, round eyes that seemed to look directly into Jake's soul and find it wanting. The alien said something else, more urgently this time, and Jake caught a few words that his universal translator managed: protect and young, and what sounded suspiciously like please. "Oh, hell no," Jake said. "I'm a salvage operator, not a daycare center." The alien died with what Jake could only describe as a look of profound relief, which left Jake standing in a crashed ship, staring at 2 alien cubs who were staring right back at him with the kind of expectant silence that promised nothing but trouble. One of them made a sound, a tiny chirping sound that somehow managed to be both adorable and terrifying. The other one pressed its face against the barrier and blinked slowly. Jake Martinez had exactly 3 rules for living peacefully in the ass exam of the galaxy. As he reached for the release mechanism on the compartment, he realized he was about to break all of them. The cubs, as it turned out, were about as domesticated as a pair of miniature black holes. Jake discovered this approximately 3 minutes after bringing them aboard his station, when they somehow managed to turn his gravity generator into what could only be described as a very expensive pinball machine. "Okay," Jake said, watching his coffee supplies float past the viewport in a gentle spiral. "New rule, no touching the shiny things that keep us alive." The cubs tilted their heads in unison, which would have been cute if Jake hadn't already learned that this particular gesture preceded every act of creative destruction they'd committed so far. They chirped something that sounded almost apologetic, then immediately began investigating his tool cabinet with the focused intensity of tiny, furry demolition experts. Jake consulted his database for alien childcare protocols. His computer, with the kind of helpful attitude that made Jake wonder why he'd ever trusted artificial intelligence, informed him that there were exactly 0 entries for his current situation. Apparently, most species had the common sense not to leave their young with random humans. "Great," he muttered, "flying by the seat of my pants it is." He tried feeding them first. Human logic suggested that small, growing things needed food. The cubs sniffed his emergency rations with the kind of polite disdain usually reserved for particularly bad poetry, then proceeded to demonstrate that they were apparently carnivorous by attempting to eat his wrench. Not food, Jake said, gently extracting the tool from tiny jaws that could probably crack titanium. Tools are not food. The cubs exchanged what could only be called a look. Jake was beginning to suspect they understood him perfectly and were just playing dumb for entertainment value. It was exactly the kind of thing he'd have done as a kid, if he'd been an apex predator species with opposable thumbs and no concept of personal property. Next came the sleeping arrangements. Jake cleared out his spare storage compartment, lined it with his softest blankets, and created what he generously called a nest. The cubs examined his handiwork with the critical eye of interior decorators, then promptly relocated to his pilot's chair, where they curled up together and fell asleep. Of course, Jake said. Why would anyone want to sleep in the carefully prepared bed when you can have the chair that controls life support? It was while he was watching them sleep, and definitely not thinking about how peaceful they looked, that his proximity sensors started screaming. Jake checked his displays and felt his stomach drop somewhere around his ankles. Ship approaching. Big ship. The kind of ship that didn't need to ask permission before taking whatever it wanted. The vessel that came into view was sleek, predatory, and covered in the same aggressive architecture as the crashed ship. It was also roughly the size of Jake's entire station, which suggested that whoever was flying it had strong opinions about personal space and the resources to enforce them. A communication channel opened without Jake's permission. The face that appeared on his screen was similar to the dead alien, but bigger, scarred, and wearing what could only be described as a uniform designed by someone who thought intimidating was a lifestyle choice. "I am Admiral Vex of the Korthani Battle Fleet," the alien announced in perfectly clear standard. "I am tracking one of our vessels. Surrender the location of my warriors, or I will reduce this pathetic outpost to its component atoms." Jake glanced at the cubs, who had woken up and were watching the screen with interest. One of them made a happy chirping sound that Jake was pretty sure meant Daddy's home. The other one climbed onto Jake's shoulder and settled there like it owned the place. "About that," Jake said, trying to figure out how to explain that he'd accidentally become an interstellar babysitter. "We might need to have a conversation." Admiral Vex materialized on Jake's station with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd been practicing his entrances. He was even more imposing in person, 8.5 feet of scarred muscle and barely contained violence, wearing armor that looked like it had been forged in the heart of a dying star and quenched in the tears of his enemies. Jake, wearing yesterday's jumpsuit and holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago, felt slightly underdressed for the occasion. "Where?" Beck demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made small planets reconsider their foreign policy. "Are my warriors?" Jake opened his mouth to explain, but before he could get a word out, both cubs launched themselves at the Admiral with delighted squeals. They bounced off his armored chest like fuzzy projectiles and immediately began climbing him like he was the galaxy's most intimidating jungle gym. Vex froze. Completely, utterly froze. His expression shifted from righteous fury to does not compute so fast that Jake wondered if someone had just divided by 0 in the Admiral's brain. They're fine," Jake said helpfully. "A little energetic, but fine." One cub had made it to Vex's shoulder and was now grooming the Admiral's head crest with the kind of thorough attention usually reserved for archaeological expeditions. The other had discovered that Vex's armor made interesting noises when tapped, and was conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive acoustic survey. "You," Vex said slowly, his gaze moving from the cubs to Jake and back again. "Kept them alive." "Well, yeah," Jake said. "What was I supposed to do, let him starve?" Vex's eyes widened. In his species, Jake realized with growing horror, that was probably exactly what most predators would have done. Survival of the fittest and all that. The fact that Jake had not only kept them alive, but apparently made them happy, was sending all kinds of wrong messages. "They are bonded to you," Vex observed, his voice carrying a note that Jake couldn't quite identify. It might have been awe, it might have been terror. It was definitely not good news. "Bonded is a strong word," Jake said. "I prefer temporarily babysitting until their actual guardian shows up, which would be you, I'm guessing." The cub on Vex's shoulder chose that moment to make a contented purring sound and rub its face against the Admiral's head. Vex looked down at Jake with something that might have been respect, if respect came with a side order of mortal fear. "In all my years," Vex said carefully, "I have never seen Korthani young respond to an alien presence with anything other than immediate violence. They are bred for war, trained from birth to recognize only strength. For them to accept you, to trust you—" He paused, clearly trying to process the implications. "What manner of apex predator are you, human?" Jake blinked. I'm sorry, what now? Do not play coy with me, Vex said, though his tone was more respectful than threatening. Only the most dominant predator could command the loyalty of Corthani Young. Your reputation must be legendary across the hunting grounds of space. Jake looked down at his coffee-stained jumpsuit, then at the cubs, who had apparently decided that Vex was acceptable furniture, and were now using him as a combination jungle gym and grooming station. There's been a misunderstanding, Jake started. Indeed, Vex interrupted. I underestimated you. To think that I came here prepared for battle, when I should have come bearing tribute. The Admiral attempted something that might have been a bow, which was complicated by the fact that he was currently serving as a playground for two energetic cubs. I formally request that you continue to train our young in your predatory ways. Jake stared. My predatory ways? Your hunting techniques must be extraordinary, Vex continued, warming to his theme. The way you have taught them to trust, to show affection. These are clearly advanced pack bonding strategies that I had not considered. One of the cubs chose that moment to climb onto Jake's head and settle there like a fuzzy hat. The other made an indignant noise and began climbing Jake's leg, apparently unwilling to let its sibling have the high ground. Yeah, Jake said weakly as he became a living climbing structure. Pack bonding strategies. That's exactly what this is. The cubs, now both perched on various parts of Jake's anatomy, looked supremely satisfied with their positions. Vex watched this display with the kind of fascination usually reserved for religious experiences. Remarkable, the Admiral breathed. I must inform the Council immediately. This changes everything. 3 weeks later, Jake's quiet little salvage station had transformed into what could only be described as the galaxy's most unlikely pilgrimage site. His proximity sensors hadn't stopped beeping since Admiral Vex had spread the word about the human apex predator who had successfully domesticated Corthani battle cubs, using mysterious pack bonding techniques. Jake stared out his viewport at the collection of ships orbiting his asteroid. There was a Zenthari dreadnought, 2 Vaxan exploration vessels, something that looked like a floating cathedral from the Ethereal Collective, and at least 6 ships he couldn't identify, but which bristled with enough weapons to sterilize a small solar system. This is insane, he muttered to the cubs, who had grown considerably in the past few weeks and now resembled small, furry tanks with attitude problems. They were currently engaged in what Jake had learned to call tactical napping, a process that involved claiming the most inconvenient possible locations and defending them with tiny claws and wounded dignity. His communication array lit up with another incoming request. Jake had stopped counting after the 15th delegation that morning. Greetings, legendary human predator, came a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a synthesizer. I am War Chief Grontok of the Bloodfang Mercenary Company. We seek audience with the one who has achieved the impossible. The impossible being what, exactly? Jake asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. You have tamed the untamable, Grontok replied with something that might have been reverence. The Corthani Young show you pack loyalty. This suggests hunting prowess beyond our comprehension. We wish to learn your ways. Jake looked down at the cubs. One was using his boot as a pillow. The other was methodically destroying what used to be his favorite wrench, not out of malice, but apparently because it made satisfying crunching sounds. My ways, Jake repeated. Yes, your legendary patience techniques, your dominance displays, your advanced territory marking strategies. Jake tried to figure out what the hell Grontok was talking about, then remembered yesterday's incident, when he told the cubs no chewing on the life support and they'd actually stopped. To an outside observer who didn't understand the concept of basic discipline, it probably did look like some kind of mystical predator magic. Right, Jake said. Those ways. 20 minutes later, Jake found himself giving his first official predator wisdom consultation to a room full of beings who could have used him as a toothpick. The cubs sat beside him like furry advisors, occasionally making helpful commentary that his guests interpreted as profound strategic insights. The key, Jake said, making it up as he went along, is consistency. When you establish a boundary, you have to maintain it. The assembled alien warriors leaned forward with the intensity of theology students discovering a new gospel. War Chief Grontok was taking notes on what appeared to be a tactical datapad. But what if the young resist? Asked a Zenthari delegate, whose translator made them sound like a caffeinated librarian. What if they challenge your authority? Jake thought about the time one of the cubs had refused to stop eating his coffee supplies. You redirect their energy, give them something else to focus on, something that satisfies their natural instincts but doesn't destroy your stuff. The Zenthari made a noise that suggested profound enlightenment. Brilliant. Channeling destructive impulses into constructive outlets. Why did we never consider this? It's pretty basic child psychology, Jake said. Child psychology, Grontok repeated reverently. Is this a human war discipline? Sure, Jake said, because explaining actual child psychology to a room full of professional killers seemed like it would take longer than he had. We use it for tactical preparation. One of the cubs chose that moment to climb onto his lap and demand attention by headbutting his chest. Jake absently scratched behind its ears, which caused it to make a contented rumbling sound. The room fell silent. Every alien present stared at the display with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching physics laws being rewritten in real time. The submission display, whispered someone from the back. It voluntarily presents vulnerable areas for your inspection. And the purgroll of acceptance, added the Zenthari. I have never seen a Korthani make that sound to any non-Korthani. Jake realized that his casual affection was being interpreted as some kind of advanced dominance technique. The cub in question, oblivious to its role in Jake's accidental reputation, had fallen asleep and was now snoring quietly against his chest. The ultimate display of trust, Grontok breathed. It renders itself completely helpless in your presence. Your predatory mastery is beyond question. Jake's other cub, not to be outdone, climbed up and settled on his shoulder, creating what Jake thought of as his daily furry accessory collection, but which his audience clearly saw as proof of his legendary pack leadership abilities. I don't suppose, Jake said hopefully, any of you would be interested in taking over their care? They're great kids, but I'm really more of a machinery guy. The suggestion was met with the kind of shocked silence usually reserved for proposing to blow up the local sun. You would abandon your pack? The Zenthari sounded scandalized. But they have chosen you. To reject such loyalty would be monstrous. Plus, added Grontok helpfully, we've already put word out about your success. Half the galaxy's predator species want to send their young for your training program. My what now? Jake asked. The Jake Martinez Academy for Advanced Predatory Excellence, Grontok read from his datapad. Applications are already flooding in. The Razorwing clans of proximity want to send 12 juveniles. The Shadow Hunters of the Void have offered their entire yearly tribute for just one consultation. Jake stared at the list of requests scrolling across Grontok's pad. Ship after ship, species after species, all wanting to learn the human predator secrets that would help their young become better killers. The irony was not lost on him that his reputation as the galaxy's most feared predator was built entirely on teaching alien children to be polite, share their toys, and not bite people without provocation. Well, Jake said to the sleeping cubs, I guess we're in the education business now. Jake was in the middle of explaining to a delegation of crystalline hive minds why timeout corners were an effective territorial dominance reinforcement technique when every proximity alarm on his station started screaming at once. The cubs, now nearly full-grown and roughly the size of small shuttles, immediately went from sleepy predator puppies to battle-ready killing machines in approximately 0.3 seconds. Their scales shifted from their usual friendly silver to a deep, aggressive red that Jake had learned meant someone's about to have a very bad day. Well, Jake said, watching his sensor display fill up with hostile contacts, this is new. Through his viewport, space was suddenly crowded with ships that definitely hadn't been invited to the party. They were sleek, black, and covered in the kind of weapons that suggested their owners had strong opinions about other people's continued existence. Pirates, Jake realized with the sinking feeling that came with recognizing impending disaster. Admiral Vex's voice crackled through the comm system. Jake Martinez, we have a situation. The Crimson Void Syndicate has arrived in force. 27 assault vessels, including their flagship Bone Crusher. They appear to be unhappy about your growing influence in this sector. My influence? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You have been training the young of 17 different predator species, Vex explained with what sounded like pride. The pirates see this as a threat to their recruitment programs. They can no longer simply kidnap juveniles and force them into service if said juveniles have been trained in advanced resistance techniques. Jake thought about the resistance techniques he'd been teaching, which mostly consisted of don't go with strangers and tell a trusted adult if someone makes you uncomfortable. Apparently, basic stranger danger protocols were revolutionary concepts in the galactic underworld. The communication array lit up with an incoming transmission from the pirate fleet. The face that appeared on screen looked like someone had crossed a barracuda with a particularly unpleasant tax auditor. "I am Captain Scrack of the Crimson Void," the pirate announced. "You will surrender immediately, or we will demonstrate why we are the most feared raiders in this quadrant." Jake looked around his station. The alien delegates who had come seeking wisdom were now looking at him expectantly. War Chief Grontok was flexing his massive arms with anticipation. The Zenthari were making excited chittering sounds. Even the usually stoic ethereal collective representative was glowing with what Jake had learned to recognize as combat readiness. "We might expect you to lead them into battle." Vex's voice came through a private channel. "As the apex predator who trained their young. The honor of command is yours by right." "I'm a salvage operator," Jake hissed back. "I fix broken things and drink coffee. I don't do space battles." One of the cubs nudged his elbow and made a questioning chirp. Jake looked down at them, his pack, as everyone insisted on calling them, and realized they were waiting for his decision. Not because they saw him as some legendary predator, but because they trusted him. They genuinely believed he would keep them safe. "Oh hell," Jake muttered. "Grontok, how many ships do we have?" 12 combat vessels, the war chief replied immediately. "All crewed by warriors whose young you have trained. They await your orders." Jake stared at the tactical display. 12 ships against 27 didn't sound like great odds. But then again, he'd been accidentally running a military academy for the past month without realizing it. Maybe it was time to see what his students had actually learned. "Okay," Jake said, trying to channel every military movie he'd ever seen. "Here's what we're going to do." The plan Jake outlined was not, by any reasonable military standard, a proper battle strategy. It was more like an elaborate game of hide-and-seek, combined with the kind of guerrilla tactics that human children had been using against authority figures since the invention of childhood. "You want us to scatter?" Warship Grontok sounded confused. "Not scatter," Jake corrected. "Disperse and regroup, classic pack hunting behavior. We make ourselves look weak and disorganized, draw them in, then hit them from unexpected angles." The cubs perked up at this, recognizing the principles behind every game of tag they'd ever played with Jake. They began making excited chirping sounds that his translation software unhelpfully rendered as "tactical enthusiasm detected." "The cubs will coordinate communications," Jake continued, making it up as he went along. "They know all our people, they can relay orders faster than standard comm channels, and the pirates won't recognize their communication patterns." What Jake didn't mention was that he was essentially turning a space battle into an elaborate version of playground tactics, with the cubs serving as the galaxy's most overqualified game coordinators. The battle, when it began, was unlike anything the sector had ever seen. Jake's pack scattered in apparent panic, looking for all the world like a group of frightened prey animals fleeing superior predators. The pirates, confident in their numerical advantage, spread out to hunt down the fleeing ships. That's when Jake's real strategy kicked in. The cubs, using their natural pack communication, coordinated attacks with surgical precision. Ships would appear from behind asteroids, strike fast and hard, then vanish before the pirates could respond. It was less like a space battle, and more like watching a very large, very angry predator toy with its prey. "Target their engines, not their weapons," Jake ordered. "We're not trying to kill them, we're trying to strand them." "Merciful victory," Grontok breathed over the comm. "You disable rather than destroy. Such confidence in your own superiority that you do not even see them as threats worth killing." Jake, who was actually trying to minimize casualties, because he wasn't a psychopath, decided not to correct that interpretation. The pirates' flagship, the Bone Crusher, found itself suddenly surrounded by ships that had appeared from seemingly impossible angles. Captain Scrack's face reappeared on Jake's screen, but the arrogant sneer had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like terror. "What manner of devil are you?" Scrack demanded. Jake looked at the cubs, who were coordinating the final phase of their game with the kind of focused intensity they usually reserved for particularly challenging puzzles. Then he looked at the screen full of alien warriors who genuinely believed he was the most dangerous predator in known space. "I'm a human," Jake said simply, "and these are my cubs. You threaten my pack." The way he said it, with the cubs flanking him and the evidence of his tactical genius playing out across the battlefield, apparently convinced Captain Scrock that further resistance was futile. "We surrender," the pirate said quickly. "We surrender to the human apex predator and his battle pack." Jake cut the transmission and looked around at the expectant faces of his students. Outside, the disabled pirate ships were floating helplessly, while his pack maintained a protective formation around his station. Well, he said to the cubs, I guess we won. The cubs chirped proudly and settled against him, clearly pleased with their role in the victory. Around the station, Jake could hear the celebrating voices of aliens who genuinely believed they had just witnessed the greatest tactical display in galactic history. Jake Martinez, salvage operator and accidental military genius, reached for his coffee mug and tried to figure out how he was going to explain this one. 6 months later, Jake Martinez stood in what used to be his modest salvage station and was now, according to the gleaming plaque Admiral Vex had insisted on installing, the Jake Martinez Intergalactic Academy for Advanced Predatory Excellence and Diplomatic Pack Bonding. The name was longer than some of his previous relationships. His little asteroid had been transformed into something that resembled a cross between a university campus and a military installation. If military installations typically included playground equipment designed for species with natural weapons, and the occasional tendency toward casual violence. The original salvage bay had been converted into classroom spaces, complete with reinforced walls and what his insurance company had started calling species-appropriate learning environments. Jake watched through his expanded viewport as another transport arrived. This one carrying a delegation from the Far Rim territories who had apparently heard about his revolutionary non-lethal conflict resolution techniques and wanted to enroll their entire diplomatic corps. You know, he said to the cubs, who were now fully grown and served as his co-instructors, when I moved out here, I was trying to get away from people. The cubs, whose names had evolved into Razor and Fang despite Jake's repeated attempts to call them something less intimidating, made the rumbling sound that Jake had learned meant, we find your complaints amusing but acknowledge your territorial frustration. His universal translator had gotten much better at Corthani over the months. A soft chime indicated someone at his office door. Come in, Jake called, though he already knew who it was, from the distinctive sound of power armor joints. Admiral Vex entered, ducking slightly to fit through the doorway that had been enlarged twice, and still wasn't quite adequate for his frame. Behind him walked a being that Jake had never seen before, tall, elegant, with crystalline features that shifted color in the light. Jake Martinez, Vex said formally, allow me to present Ambassador T. Sara of the Galactic Unity Council. Jake, who had learned that first impressions were important when dealing with beings who could accidentally step on small planets, stood up and offered what he hoped was an appropriately respectful nod. Razor and Fang flanked him automatically, a behavior that everyone except Jake interpreted as a calculated display of Pack's strength. The legendary human predator, Ambassador Thisara said, their voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords and possibly some kind of built-in auto-tune. Your reputation has reached even the core worlds. Has it now, Jake said, because he'd learned that non-committal responses worked better than trying to explain that his reputation was built on teaching alien children to use their words instead of their claws. Indeed, the Unity Council has been monitoring the unusual developments in this sector. Pirate activity down 60%. Territorial disputes resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Trade routes opening that have been closed for centuries. The ambassador's crystalline features shifted to what Jake thought might be approval. Most intriguing of all, 17 separate predator species, working together in unprecedented cooperation. Jake glanced at Vex, who was practically radiating pride. It's been educational, Jake said carefully. We understand, the ambassador continued, that you have developed a new form of pack-based diplomacy, one that treats former enemies as potential allies rather than threats to be eliminated. Jake thought about his actual method, which mostly consisted of putting different species young in the same room and letting them figure out that playing together was more fun than fighting. Apparently, playground politics translated surprisingly well to interstellar relations. The Unity Council, Ambassador Thisara said, would like to offer you a formal position. Chief of Interspecies Relations, with full diplomatic immunity and a substantial budget for expanding your educational program. That's very generous, Jake said, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of responsibility. Razor nudged his elbow and made a questioning sound. Jake looked down at his partner, because that's what the cubs had become, partners rather than pets or students, and saw patient wisdom in eyes that had watched him accidentally revolutionize galactic diplomacy through the simple expedient of treating everyone like they mattered. Consider, the ambassador said, what you have already accomplished. You have taken the galaxy's most aggressive species and taught them to work together. You have shown that strength can be demonstrated through protection rather than conquest. You have proven that pack loyalty can extend beyond genetic lines. Through his office window, Jake could see the latest batch of students, young beings from a dozen different worlds, all playing together in the station's recreational area. A Zenthari juvenile was teaching a group of ethereal collective younglings some kind of complex game involving floating objects and apparently gravity-defying acrobatics. 3 Korthani teens were helping a nervous Vaxen child learn to navigate the climbing structure designed for species with natural weapons. None of them were fighting. All of them were laughing, or making whatever sounds their species made when they were happy. "You've created something unprecedented," Vex added quietly. "A generation that sees cooperation as strength rather than weakness. These young ones will return to their worlds, carrying your lessons. In 20 years, 30 years, they will be the leaders, making decisions about war and peace." Jake realized what they were really offering him, not just a job, but the chance to accidentally save the galaxy one playground argument at a time. "There would be resources," the ambassador continued. "Proper facilities, funding for expansion, protection for your unique methods. The Unity Council understands that your techniques require a specific environment to be effective." "My techniques," Jake repeated, thinking about timeout corners and sharing circles and the revolutionary concept of using indoor voices during negotiations. "The Jake Martinez method," Vex said with satisfaction. "It's already being studied at military academies across 3 sectors. Your principle of tactical patience has been adopted by 6 different peacekeeping forces." Jake looked at Razor and Fang, who were watching him with the kind of patient attention that meant they were waiting for his decision, not because they saw him as their alpha or pack leader, but because they trusted his judgment. Outside, one of the ethereal collective kids had apparently mastered the climbing structure, and was now showing off for an audience of impressed peers from 4 different star systems. The sound of universal childhood triumph, the same whether it came from human vocal cords or alien harmonics, drifted through his office speakers. "All right," Jake said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them," the ambassador said immediately. "First, no military applications. What we teach here is about building relationships, not better ways to fight wars. Second, voluntary participation only. Nobody gets sent here as punishment or conscription. Third, my staff and I maintain full autonomy over curriculum and methods. And fourth," Jake continued, looking at his partners, "Razor and Fang are co-directors. This whole thing started because one of their people trusted a human to take care of their young. They get equal say in how we shape the next generation." The cubs made pleased rumbling sounds. Ambassador Thisara's features shifted through several colors before settling on what Jake hoped was agreement. "The Unity Council accepts your conditions," the ambassador said. "When can you begin expansion operations?" Jake looked around his office at the plaques and certificates and formal recognition of achievements he'd never intended to pursue. On his desk sat his original coffee mug, somehow still intact after months of alien youngsters using his station as their personal jungle gym. Next to it was a photo that Admiral Vex had taken without permission, Jake asleep in his pilot's chair, covered in sleeping cubs from 6 different species, all of them curled up together in a pile of mutual trust and comfortable exhaustion. "I guess," Jake said to the universe in general, "we already have." 2 years later, Jake Martinez, former salvage operator, accidental apex predator, and current director of the Galactic Academy for Cooperative Excellence, stood on the observation deck of his purpose-built educational facility and watched the sunrise over New Harmony Station. The station orbited a carefully selected planet that supported multiple atmospheric types, allowing students from across the galaxy to learn together regardless of their biological requirements. The facility itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, designed by architects from 17 different civilizations, and built with materials donated by governments who were still slightly bewildered by the whole situation, but couldn't argue with the results. Razor and Fang, now wearing the honorary titles of Associate Directors of Pack Dynamics, were leading this morning's session on conflict resolution through mutual interest identification. Jake watched through the classroom windows as they guided a group of young diplomats through an exercise that looked suspiciously like an elaborate game of keep-away, but which Jake knew was actually a sophisticated lesson in resource sharing and compromise. His communication console chimed with the morning's updates. Pirate activity in the Academy's operating sectors was down 93%, not because they'd been defeated, but because they were having trouble recruiting young people who had been taught that cooperation was more rewarding than exploitation. 3 territorial disputes had been resolved through Academy-trained mediators in the past month, The Unity Council was reporting unprecedented levels of interspecies cooperation on everything from trade agreements to scientific research. And Jake still wasn't entirely sure how any of it had happened. "Morning report, Director," came a familiar voice. Jake turned to see Commander Torres, formerly War Chief Grontok, approaching with a datapad and what had become their daily ritual of bewildered progress updates. "How many applications this week?" Jake asked. 473, Torres replied, including a formal request from the Andromedans to establish a sister facility in their galaxy. Jake stared. The Andromedans want to franchise us? Apparently, word has spread beyond our local galactic cluster. The concept of teaching young predators to play nicely together is being hailed as the most significant diplomatic breakthrough since the invention of universal translation. Jake sipped his coffee, still the same blend he'd been drinking when this whole adventure started, though now it was being imported at great expense from Earth, because the Unity Council had decided his personal preferences were matters of galactic security. "Any problems I need to know about?" he asked. "The usual," Torres said with amusement. "The crystalline hive mind, juveniles, have figured out how to phase through the recreational equipment. So the other species think they're cheating at tag. The Voidwalker children keep accidentally teleporting into restricted areas because they get excited and lose concentration. And apparently, yesterday's lesson on personal space boundaries resulted in the Tentacle Collective younglings organizing what they called a respectful group hug demonstration." Jake nodded. Just another typical day at the Academy that had accidentally become the galaxy's most important diplomatic institution. "Oh," Torres added, "and Admiral Vex wants to know if you'd be interested in writing a book. Something about the principles of predatory diplomacy, or how I learned to stop worrying and love my pack." Jake looked out at his students, dozens of young beings from across known space, all learning that differences could be strengths rather than sources of conflict. All discovering that the universe was more interesting when you worked together rather than against each other. "Tell the Admiral," Jake said, "that I'm still figuring it out myself." As if summoned by his words, Razor appeared at his elbow and made the questioning chirp that Jake had learned meant, "Time for morning rounds?" Fang emerged from the opposite doorway, having apparently finished helping set up the day's advanced cooperation exercises. "Right," Jake said, finishing his coffee and heading toward the door. "Let's go see how we're accidentally changing the galaxy today." As they walked through the corridors of New Harmony Station, passing classrooms full of young beings learning to see cooperation as strength, Jake Martinez reflected on the fundamental absurdity of his situation. He'd moved to the edge of nowhere to avoid dealing with people, and somehow ended up responsible for teaching the entire galaxy how to get along. But watching a Korthani teenager patiently help a nervous ethereal child with a complex puzzle, seeing former enemy species working together on group projects, hearing the sound of universal laughter echoing through corridors designed for beings who had spent centuries trying to kill each other, Jake had to admit that there were worse ways to accidentally save the universe. Even if he still had no idea what he was doing.